Welcome to the second half of the Center for Global Humanities Seminar Series. And it's starting with a bang, as from what I'm noticing now. We have a wonderful attendance for this time of year, and I think that's for a good reason. Just very briefly, for those who've never attended these events before, this is a very sort of unique forum in the city of Portland that brings together students from the University of New England and from other schools in the neighboring schools, as well as members of the public. It's part of the university's commitment to the community, and as the president always likes to say, and which I love to repeat constantly, it's a private university with a public mission, and this is part of the public mission of the University of New England, something that does not escape some of our supporters here on my left. So the speaker tonight is Jennifer Clarke Kosak, and she's an associate professor and chair of the Department of Classics at Bowdoin College. And we are also, it's part of our agenda to include our colleagues in other universities and colleges in the state of Maine. And so we are very delighted that she is actually the pioneer person to be part of this series. So thank you. Jennifer Clarke Kosak received a PhD in classical philology from the University of Michigan and her BA from Harvard Radcliffe. She has a research interest in the areas of ancient Greek medicine, ancient Greek theater, gender studies, particularly masculinity, and intellectual history. Her book, Heroic Measures, Hippocratic Medicine in the Making of European Tragedy, which was published in 2004. Unfortunately, we don't have copies for sale here because they're not easily available. But we do have a copy at the center. That means they're not cheap. Argues that Greek tragedy and Greek medical writing draw upon a common stock of ideas to construct their views on human nature and the processes of disease and treatment. She has also written articles that demonstrate the importance of Greek medical thought for understanding other authors and areas of classical Greek culture. Currently, she's writing a book on masculinity and medicine in ancient Greece. I could not be happier for having Professor Kosak give us the inaugural lecture of the spring semester. Thank you.
Well, I am just so delighted to be here, and I hope you'll bear with me while I do a little organization of technology here. But I'm so grateful to Anwar Majid and the Center for Global Humanities for having me here today. As a teacher of classics at a small liberal arts college that I think some of you have heard of here in Maine, I am particularly attached to both the terms global and humanities, and I'm very excited to participate in this series. I also will warn you in advance that we classical literature people tend to be very text-based, so it appears to be practically a requirement at lectures that we always have to provide bits of reading to go along for people. Hence, although the technology people always warn against, making people read off the screen, you will find a number of texts to look at today. But I have tried to intersperse some images, from time to time to kind of lighten the mood or maybe darken it, depending on what they are. So get ready to read, and here we go. So, but not immediately. So let me begin today with the Iliad, a text that partakes of centuries-old stories told in Mesopotamian and Caucasus regions, transforms them into a Greek heroic tale, which then forms the basis of self-understanding for numerous generations of Greeks in the Greco-Roman world, and finally endures as a text to which many readers and writers have returned again and again to examine its meditations on mortality, friendship, and responsibility, among other things. The Iliad begins with announcing implicitly its own ending, since it speaks not only of the anger of Achilles, cause of the great destruction, but also of its consequences, the death of many heroes. The situation, the poet Homer says, was the fulfillment of Zeus's plan, the Dios Boulé, as it's called in Greek. And everybody sits around and wonders, well, what is the Dios Boulé? What is the plan? What does that mean? But we won't talk about that tonight. I've been talking about that all day, actually. So I was saying I've been teaching Homer literally all day, so I'm very excited about Homer. I'll try not to spend too much time on it. But then the poet, though, says, okay, It's the anger of Achilles. The poet begins to circle back, seeking the beginning of the story. It started, he says, with the quarrel of Agamemnon and Achilles. Yes, but who caused the quarrel? Well, the poet says, the son of Zeus and Leto, Apollo. But why? Because he was angered. And angered, he had driven a terrible disease through the army camp. But why was he angry? Well, because the son of Atreus, Agamemnon, had dishonored his priest. But how did that happen? Well, because the priest, Chryses, came to the camp to ransom his daughter, whom, we soon learn, had been captured by the Achaean army in battle and given as a war prize to Agamemnon. As the poet launches into the action proper, we see Agamemnon reject the priest's plea in, I might add, a very insulting manner. The priest Chryses retreats and begs Apollo to punish the Greeks. He does not specifically mention disease, but asks that, quote, the Greeks may pay for my tears with your arrows. And now the poet says, I told you you'd have to read, but I'll read with you. Phoebus Apollo heard him and strode down along the pinnacles of Olympus, angered in his heart, carrying across his shoulders the bow and hooded quiver, and the shafts clashed on the shoulders of the god, walking angrily. He came as night comes down, and knelt then apart and opposite the ships and let go an arrow. Terrible was the clash that rose from the bow of silver. First he went after the mules and the circling hounds, then let go a tearing arrow against the men themselves and struck them. The corpse fires burned everywhere and did not stop burning. 9 days up and down the host ranged the gods' arrows. But on the 10th, Achilles called the people to assembly. Apollo thus responds swiftly and ruthlessly to the prayers of his priest and punishes the Greeks by killing them with his arrows, the dread disease the poet had mentioned earlier. But the poet does not dwell on too many details of the disease itself. He turns to the response. Achilles calls the assembly in order to figure out how to stop the disease, which he states without hesitation is caused by Apollo. He asked for a prophet, a man, Homer says, who knows, quote, the things that are, the things that will be, and the things past, who can say why Apollo was angry and how they might appease him. So let me pause to make a few observations here about this passage. First, a small point of medical interest. Note that Apollo starts with the animals first. The animals are surely not responsible in any way for the treatment of the priest Chryses and his daughter, but killing them does have consequences for their human owners. Scholars of Greek medicine also suggest that this passage reflects a pathological reality. Diseases often do arise in an animal population and then transfer to humans living in close proximity to them. Why does Homer include these technical details? Do they provide a greater sense of authenticity for his audience, who are, after all, not heroes, but ordinary human beings, who may have experienced this kind of disease narrative? A second point, Achilles does not seek out the army doctors, of whom there are at least 2 that we know of, for help in curing this plague, but instead, convinced that Apollo has caused it out of anger, seeks remedies in religious practices. What is also striking, and perhaps fits in with the first point about the dogs and the mules, is that none of the great chieftains succumb to the disease. In the world of the Iliad, great heroes die in battle with other great heroes. They do not die from disease, whether it's a plague or a cold. Thus, in this plague, the animals and the ordinary men suffer because of the actions of their leader. Disease is a punishment that strikes those who are not directly responsible. In the title of my talk today, I refer to 2 concepts, balance and narrative, and you may be wondering at this point what the Iliad has to do with these things, since I see maybe some narrative but hardly any balance. Let me begin with narrative then. As many modern scholars have argued, the concept of narrative is essential to the human experience of disease. Patients and doctors may tell different kinds of stories, but each uses narratives to account for the particular course of a disease in a given patient. Even if practitioners of modern biomedicine, with its understanding of germs and viruses as impartial organisms merely seeking survival in the Darwinian struggle that all organisms undergo, even as these practitioners attempt an objective approach to each patient, the fact remains that medicine is a deeply human endeavor, and thus, because it is human, and human choices and behaviors are inextricably mixed with disease. As scholars Alan Brandt and Paul Rosen have noted, health and morality have always been deeply and fundamentally entangled. Despite modern beliefs in the neutrality of disease itself, the question of individual culpability or responsibility remains, and the fundamental question, why me or why you, demands an answer. Another scholar, Warwick Anderson, has suggested that in fact modern medicine is impoverished by the mechanistic answers it supplies to the fundamental question of individual suffering. He writes, "The romance of technology is so entrancing and indeed so physically effective that as practitioners we may be blind to the potential for a moral structuring of disease, or we may simply believe that non-technical explanation is none of our business. Now we tell our patients that it is just a virus. Why me? Why now? Ask our patients, and we stay not to give an answer." Another scholar, Howard Brody, suggests that if, quote, physicians take refuge behind objectivity and so remain detached from their patient's suffering, unquote, then they actually hinder the patient's healing by not providing a meaning to the suffering. At the same time, and I'm throwing a lot of scholars at you, Arthur Frank has argued that it is imperative for patients to learn to tell their own stories and not to wait for others to tell it to them. Medical anthropologists and historians such as Arthur Kleinman and Charles Rosenberg remind us that narratives of health and disease are culturally contingent. And as Rosenberg puts it, I'll put this up on the screen for you, disease is at once a biological event, a generation-specific repertoire of verbal constructs reflecting medicine's intellectual and institutional history, an occasion for and potential legitimation of public policy, an aspect of social role and individual intrapsychic identity, a sanction for cultural values, and a structuring element in doctor-patient interactions. In some ways, disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does, by perceiving, naming, and responding to it. I'll let that sink in for a minute. I can't talk about everything that he's put together up here tonight, but I think that this is, to some extent, at the heart of some of the questions that I am trying to answer in my work. The successful practice of medicine thus depends on awareness of cultural differences, which can and do change over time. In my talk today, I want to explore some of the ways that ancient Greeks framed their experiences and understandings of health and disease, and I argue that when we examine their stories, the concept of balance becomes an increasingly common essential feature of their belief system, although, again, in some intriguing ways, and it's not a universal story either. So if we return briefly to the Iliad, the epic is both cautious and celebratory of the notion of excess. The heroes of the Iliad tend to be excessive in everything they do, and Achilles is exceptionally so. He has anger, so much that it cannot be contained. Interestingly, his anger, he suggests, is physiologically intrinsic to him. Thus, in Book 16, he imagines how the other men speak of him, saying, "Hard son of Peleus, your mother nursed you on gall, bile." The word for bile here is kolos, which elsewhere simply means anger, but it is related to the word kole, which becomes the standard word for bile in later Greek texts and becomes an essential part of the whole Greek medical idea of humoral medicine, which is the idea that we have these substances in our bodies, including bile, phlegm, the two big ones, also sometimes blood and water, and then we sometimes also divide the bile into two different types of bile, and eventually that comes into the Renaissance and gives us our temperaments. So we have choleric individuals and sanguine individuals and all these different kinds of ideas that come out of humoral medicine. It maybe goes right back to the Iliad. However, so it's possible that bile is part of what makes Achilles so angry. Now, excessive bile, and certainly excess, is part of what makes Achilles great, but it is also what makes him so dangerous. Although later Greeks read and heard the Iliad almost obsessively, they did not necessarily embrace the excessive qualities of Achilles as a goal for themselves. Indeed, given that his mother was a goddess, it would have been difficult for any real human to replicate Achilles' nature. Nonetheless, while Greek boys were instructed to emulate Achilles' desire for honor and glory, they were also repeatedly urged to practice self-control in both mind and body. Now, the Iliad features a king, Agamemnon, who does not practice self-control, and his men pay a price for it with the plague. Why do they suffer? Why do they get the plague? The author of the Iliad does not seem to be very interested in taking on that question directly, but the situation surely reflects his realistic view of human nature, that often some people suffer because of the actions of others. Another early Greek source, Hesiod's Works and Days, describes the presence of disease in the world in the following way. He says, other countless troubles roam among humans, for the earth is full of bad things, and full is the sea. And there are diseases for human beings in the day, while some diseases at night spontaneously visit, carrying evils to humans in silence, since clever Zeus took away their voice. Now, the diseases come into the world from Pandora's jar. So we know it as a box, but it's technically a jar. They come in there, and Pandora was explicitly fashioned by the gods as a punishment for human beings, who were the beneficiaries of Prometheus' kindness, and hence, once again, suffering is displaced from the more powerful to the less so, etc., etc. Not part of the told story, but at any rate, they come ultimately then as a form of punishment. But in this passage here, the diseases as they individually come to human beings are said to come for no particular reason. Zeus is ultimately responsible for them, but this passage emphasizes their spontaneous quality, a randomness that is perhaps more depressing than the punitive actions of Apollo that we see in the Iliad. Is it better to know that you are being punished or to have absolutely no reason for your suffering at all? Such depressing randomness is depicted again in the very different context of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War. In Book 2 of that work, Thucydides famously describes in resolutely technical fashion the plague that struck Athens in 430 BCE. Although the section is too long for me to go over in all of its gory details today, I would like to draw your attention to several points of interest. First, Thucydides emphasizes that everyone was equally susceptible to the terrible disease. And let's read some of this. Some victims were neglected and died. Others died despite a great deal of care. There was not a single remedy, you might say, which ought to be applied to give relief, for what helped one sufferer harmed another. No kind of constitution, whether strong or weak, proved sufficient against the plague, but it killed all off, whatever regime was used to care for them. He then goes on to describe some of the emotional and social effects of the plague. And here we go. The most terrible aspect of the whole affliction was the despondency that resulted when someone realized that he had the disease. People immediately lost hope, and so through their attitude of mind were much more likely to let themselves go and not hold out. In addition, one person caught the disease through caring for another, and so they died like sheep. This was the greatest cause of loss of life. Thucydides doesn't tell us specifically who died in the plague. So it may be that it may be also that the plague went after the nameless commons, as it does in the Iliad. But he does tell us that he himself caught the plague and survived. So it was possible to survive it, but he puts himself forward as not only an eyewitness to it, but somebody who experienced it himself. His emphasis then that everybody, no matter who they were, good or bad, could catch the plague seems to be a little bit different than what we see in the Iliad. Now, he continues, and I'm going to continue with a slightly different translator because this isn't in the Lloyd volume that I recommended for people today. he writes, if they were unwilling in their fear to approach one another, they perished in isolation, and many homes were emptied for want of someone to give care. If they drew near, they were destroyed, especially those, that should be with a claim to virtue. For out of honor, they did not spare themselves in visiting friends. In this passage, then, the most virtuous and honorable died just as much as the fearful, even more, perhaps. The disease makes no distinction among its victims. Despite the randomness of the suffering that is described in clinical detail by Thucydides in chapter 49, as we just read, we should note that the section's resonances with the Iliad, all of which emphasize divergences from the earlier plague and fit with Thucydides' insistence that the Peloponnesian War was the greatest of all time. Oh, sorry. That was a complete sentence, excuse me. They all emphasize that it was the greatest war of all time. So here's some other divergences. For example, whereas Homer's Achaeans are able to stop the plague by returning Chryseis, the girl, washing off their pollution in the sea, and performing sacrifice, Thucydides writes that neither medical treatment nor religious rites helped the suffering Athenians. He says, the doctors were unable to cope, since they were treating the disease for the first time, and in ignorance. Indeed, the more they came into contact with sufferers, the more liable they were to lose their own lives. No device of men was any help. Moreover, supplication at sanctuaries, resort to divination, and the like were all unavailing. In the end, people were overwhelmed by the disaster and abandoned their efforts against it. In order to emphasize the extraordinary nature of the disaster, Thucydides describes the bizarre behavior of the birds and dogs. All the birds and animals that feed on men either did not approach, even though there were many unburied, or died if they tasted them. And as proof, the absence of birds of this type was unmistakable, and they were seen neither elsewhere nor in this context. Dogs, on the other hand, made it more possible to notice the results because they live with men. As noted before in the opening lines of the Iliad, Homer speaks of dogs and birds feasting on the bodies of heroes who died in battle, and then later speaks of how the dogs themselves died in the plague. Here, Thucydides draws attention to the strange behavior of the dogs and birds in order to underscore the completely unusual nature of this event. Humans die of disease before animals, and the disease forces animals to alter their typical behaviors. Even as Thucydides provides a detailed narrative, he insists the event is literally kreison logou, as he says, which means greater than narration, beyond the power of speech. The word logos, the great Greek word for word, narration, speech. He says it defies description. Although he is careful to include the many explanations of the disease provided by others, he dismisses all attempts to explain the cause of the disease in either the moral, religious, or medical terms of his contemporaries. In that earlier, thus in one of those earlier passages that we read, you might notice he talked about the powerlessness of the doctors in the face of disease. And he later speaks dismissively in another passage of, quote, all the many types of evacuations of bile that doctors can name. And he says, I'm not going to talk about them, but, doctors, they go on about bile. Such language has often occasioned surprise among Thucydides' readers, since he himself is so clearly influenced by contemporary trends in medical theory, meaning that 5th century big-time medical theorists, and which we'll get into in a bit. Such influence is evident both in his account of the plague and in his history overall. So, for example, Thucydides justifies his description of the plague's symptoms with the following words. He says, I shall give a statement of what it was like, which people can study in case it should ever attack again, to equip themselves with foreknowledge, so that they shall not fail to recognize it. These words echo what Thucydides says in justifying his own approach to writing history. And he hopes, as he says, the following. But as for anyone who wishes to have a clear view both of the events that happened and those that will happen in such or a similar way in future according to human probability, if they deem my account to be of use, that is sufficient for me. Understanding history, he suggests, will allow us to make sense of the present, because human nature is constant and predictably so, an idea which is also an essential tenet of a number of Greek natural philosophers and medical thinkers. Thus, in Thucydides' account of the plague, we see an extraordinary tension between the random and indescribable on the one hand and the regular, explicable, recurring on the other. He suggests that this will happen, it could happen again, and that's why he's describing it now. Just as he says the war occurs like this. War tends to happen again because humans are human. We always fight. So I'm going to describe the war, and then in the future you will all be able to notice that war is coming because you'll see what I wrote about. The notion of this idea that there are symptoms, as it were, symptoms to history that we can read and describe then and predict then what will happen. Now, G.E.R. Lloyd, the scholar whose book I recommended as reading for today, he argues, it was above all in rendering explicit many long-held implicit assumptions about the way the world works that Greeks invented nature. There's a big discussion always in studies of Greek science and medicine. For a long time, there was kind of this privileging of Greeks as the rational ones. You know, those Egyptians and those Babylonians, they didn't know what they were doing. Well, I say the word Egypt today, and it's all on the front of our minds, I'm sure. But back then, apparently, those Egyptians, they were just, you know, they knew a lot about the body, but they weren't interested in thinking about it. This is a pretty primitive view, I think. So then the question is, well, okay, yes, but the Greeks and the Egyptians and the Babylonians all do talk about things differently in some way. So what is the nature of that difference? How can we describe it if we don't simply want to sort of say primitive versus sophisticated? And one of the things that Lloyd is particularly well known for talking about then is this notion that the Greeks invented nature in the sense of thinking of taking all these implicit assumptions. Everybody in antiquity pretty much knew that, you know, winter would come, and then after that there would be spring, and after that there would be summer, and then, you know, that this would happen year after year. There was a natural law of it, but they didn't think about it as scientific law. It was part of their world, but it was an implicit assumption. And what the Greeks do is they become explicit about that assumption. They want to sort of think about nature and define its laws and talk about it in a particular way that seems to be peculiar to them. So whereas historical, legal, and dramatic texts and documentary evidence from religious sanctuaries suggests that belief in the unpredictable and supernatural and dependence on gods in all areas of human life remained integral to many aspects of Greek daily experience, the medical writers of the 5th and 4th century BCE are particularly impressive in their optimistic belief in the power of human minds and medical technology to understand and meet the challenges of disease by, as it were, co-opting nature's laws. If you can understand the laws, you can figure out how to handle them. For the medical writers of this period, disease is no longer caused by a divine attack or a willful set of disease entities roaming about the world. It is instead a product of the forces of nature that, if described and understood, can be controlled. The treatises of these writers were compiled at some point in antiquity into a group of treatises ascribed to the great 5th century BCE doctor Hippocrates, and we refer to them now as the Hippocratic corpus. We don't know which, if any of them, were written by Hippocrates himself. So this is always very cumbersome when you're working on this thing. You can't say Hippocrates. You have to say Hippocratic writer. And so I will do that. I will talk about Hippocratic writers. And there's also about 63 different treatises within the Hippocratic corpus. They all have their own names. So I'll be talking about the names of these particular treatises within the Hippocratic corpus written by the Hippocratic writers. So at any rate, the medical ideas found in the Hippocratic corpus do not all entirely align with one another, but all of the authors can be said to represent an interest in naturalism or rationalism, an attempt to categorize and systematize understandings of the body and disease. Although I do not want to downplay the distinctiveness of these thinkers, I am particularly interested in how their work intersects with accounts of nature and disease found elsewhere in Greek culture. Their ideas, in order to be convincing and effective, had to resonate with the disease concepts of the population at large. And so the narratives that they provide often make use of metaphors and motifs that are widespread in Greek literature. Thus, for example, the Hippocratic doctors repeatedly emphasize the value of prognosis. And we should note how the writer of the treatise Prognosis begins his work. This is probably written, oh, heavens. Oh, yes, I was going to put this plague. That was one of my delightful pictures that I was going to show you while you were listening to me. Oh, rats. Okay, well, there it is. Oh, the plague in the air, everybody dying, So anyway, okay, well, here's the doctor as the hero, waiting to, as we see the doctors begin to kind of put themselves into the category of heroes who can do anything and save the people. But here we go with Prognosis. He says, I hold it is an excellent thing for a physician to practice forecasting. For if he discover and declare unaided by the side of his patients the present, the past, and the future, and fill in the gaps in the account given by the sick, he will be the more believed to understand the cases, so that the men will confidently entrust themselves to him for treatment. The phrase in the second sentence there, the past, the present, and the future, can be more literally translated from the Greek as the things that are, the things that have happened before, and the things that are going to happen. These words, as have often been noticed, are extremely reminiscent of what Homer and other poets say of prophets. You may remember that I quoted earlier what Homer says of Clarke, the prophet whom Achilles approaches to tell them what happened with the plague. He says that he knows the things that are, the things that will be, and the things past. And, as we just noted a little while ago, Thucydides indicated much the same idea when he speaks of the predictive value of history. He says, look, I'm telling you about the past so that we can predict the future. And here we are with our medical writers suggesting the same thing. Now, the author of Prognosis, after admitting that physicians cannot save everyone, continues by urging them nonetheless to learn as much as they can about each disease. For, as he says, for the longer time you plan to meet each emergency, the greater your power to save those who have a chance of recovery. While you will be blameless if you learn and declare beforehand those who will die and those who will get better. So, the power of foreknowledge is in itself valuable, but to the doctor, but also, it seems, to the patient. In reading Greek medical texts, one often notes the high death rate reported and cures that sound bizarre and ineffective to us, and we wonder, did it work? Medical anthropologists urge us to answer that question by asking first, what were the expectations of the patients? What was meaningful to them in terms of health and disease? The concept of prognosis, of foreknowledge of the future, seems to have had great power for Greeks of the classical period in providing a sense of control. This is not to let the doctor off the hook. The desire to avoid blame may look very suspicious to us, but again, in context, it is meant to provide, I think, some realism to the proceedings. The author of Prognosis also says in his introduction, now, he says, to restore every patient to health is impossible. To do so, indeed, would have been better even than the forecasting of the future. But as a matter of fact, men do die before the physician by his art can combat each disease. So we have this notion of the power of prognosis, that it in itself is valuable to the patient and to the doctor in his practice and his successful practice as a physician, but also apparently if he's only why would anybody want him if that's all? I mean, they apparently felt it was valuable to just know what was going to happen. That was powerful, even if they couldn't cure him. They couldn't be cured. Now, there's an additional word that I'd like to look at now in this particular passage, the word combat, before the physician by his art can combat each disease. Now, the Greek word used here is antagonisthai, and you can hear the word antagonism in that, I hope, and if you don't, I'll say it, that you should, which first appears actually in Greek historians. Now, it can be used to describe conflict in battle, certainly, but it also has a less military connotation. The notion of contend or struggle with, take on, and in particular, it's most frequently used for arguing in a court of law or debating in an assembly. Now, in this next section of my talk, I would like to take a look at the way in which Greek doctors envisioned the process of disease inside the body and their own role in healing. This aspect of Greek medicine is both new in the sense of what the Greeks are talking about, and at the same time, again, very much in keeping with contemporary developments in Greek culture. What I mean by that is that the way many Greeks see the body is intensely political, reflecting then the intensely political culture in which they operate. And here I would like to, I might add, I would like to press for at least a slight distinction between polemical and political, that we should not automatically conflate political struggle and war, which is something I think is important with this whole issue of antagonism. Are we talking about fighting, or are we talking about debating? And I know even in our own culture, we have some interesting struggles with that issue of what is, where do we draw the line when we use words like fight? So let me begin again. Let me go back a little bit and try to set up the picture here. And what I'm suggesting then, again, is the words matter, right? The words that the Hippocratic doctors use matter, that they are co-opting the language of the culture that's traditionally around them. But now we're no longer in a Homeric period. We're now in the period of Greek democracy. And so now, instead of using only language that we find traditionally about like seers and prophets, we're now beginning to get more interest in political language of a city culture. And so here we begin, then we're starting to get this starting in the 5th century. And so let me begin with a non-doctor, but somebody who is definitely interested in some of these issues that we see in the doctors themselves. And this guy named Alcmaeon of Croton, I know he's like right at the front of everybody's fingertips, right? Only exists in fragments, totally cool guy. This is one of the only things that he said, so that we know. And he said, he also wrote a treatise on the eye, though, so described the eye, so very interesting man. He writes, the balance of forces in the body, wet, dry, cold, hot, bitter, sweet, etc., maintains health, whereas monarchy among them is productive of disease. Health is the balanced mixture of these forces. And I've given you the words that he's using in Greek. He uses isonomia, equality of rights, when he's talking about the balance of forces in the body. And he says that what causes disease is monarchia, of one substance in the body. And then he says health is the balanced mixture. And word for balance is symmetron, and we get the word symmetry from that. And he talks about that as the thing that keeps us all in health. Alcmaeon lived in the early 5th century, a time of great political change in Greece. The Athenians had introduced their democratic system at the very end of the 6th century, and the war between the Persian Empire, ruled by its great kings, and the fractious community of Greek-speaking city-states occurred between 490 and 479. Although Alcmaeon himself was not from Athens, his strikingly political understanding of the body clearly privileges equality, perhaps even democracy, over monarchy. Health is a mixture, a balancing of forces. The work of the 5th century sculptor Polykleitos also demonstrates a belief in the importance of balance. Polykleitos was famous not only for his beautiful sculptures, but also for writing a treatise called the Canon, meaning law or measurement, in which he describes the rules of proportion and balance necessary to make a perfect sculpture. And here's perhaps one of his most famous sculptures, the so-called Derivorus, the spear carrier. And this sort of exemplifies his ideal. I mean, this is the great Greek body, right? The famous, all the proportions done beautifully. Of course, apparently, if you actually try to stand like he is, you would topple over. But the art here of the contrapposto, you have the bending on the one side and the straight on the other side, and all these different things that he did, that he defined very, very precisely in his treatise called the Canon. And if we take a look at another example drawn from the world of art, here's the beautiful, the Riace warriors, or the Riace bronzes, which came to light in 1972, having spent about 2 millennia under the water in the Aegean Sea. These two statues, probably dating to 460 or 450 BCE, show the Hellenic male at his finest, adult finest, although scholars have argued that they depict two slightly different images of this ideal. I'm not going to get into that, but I will concentrate, therefore, on Riace Warrior A. That's this guy. And art historian Andrew Stewart has written, this guy epitomizes the public eye's image of the hero: fearless, unyielding, jealous of his honor, quick to take offense, and implacable in requiting it. At the same time, he says, the warrior is in full control of himself, such that he does not need our approval and does not look to meet our gaze. As Stewart notes, he affects to ignore us completely while presenting his magnificent body full frontal to us. Stewart speaks of the body of this warrior with its ultra-smooth surfaces and iron-hard muscles as impenetrable as a suit of armor. The impressive, apparently invulnerable exterior of the figure also interestingly shows traces of interior physiological processes, according to the scholar Guy Métraux, who has done a detailed study of the influence of medical theory on 5th century sculpture. See, medical theory shows up everywhere. Here it comes again. Métraux points out that only male statues in this period show evidence of veins, as these warriors do, and argues that this phenomenon is connected to contemporary theories of respiration. Métraux stresses two things in his investigation. First, how the veins are emphasized at points of flexion in the body, and how this accords with similar emphasis in both medical and philosophical texts. Now, especially important in this is the notion that flexion at the knees enables humans to stand upright, and thus to distinguish themselves from animals. And then Métraux also suggests that he points out how the veins are emphasized in the hands, a second feature, the use of which makes human beings special in the world. We have the hands. That's what partly in Greek philosophical thinking, hands are an important distinguishing feature of the human being. Now, but Métraux also notes that the venous system seen on the Riace warriors reflects the nutritive function of veins in the body, and that the veins chosen for emphasis reflect the balanced system of veins which enable health. According to 5th century Greek medical theory on blood vessels, there's no such thing as circulation per se. Indeed, in the healthy body, blood moves very little. The whole idea is we get total stability. And so no blood moving around, that would be dangerous. The healthy body has a very stable and changing interior. One Hippocratic treatise called The Nature of Man speaks of 4 basic pairs of blood vessels in the body, which serve in a balanced system of oppositions to keep the body healthy. But so you have sort of, if you look at that, I wish I had a nice picture of it. It's hard to get, but you have these you have 4 veins here, 4 veins here, 4 going up and down your body, and there's no heart. It's like the veins are there. They don't go. There's no circulation or anything. And it's interesting because he talks about the veins, the author, but he doesn't speak of blood or air moving in these channels. They're just there. I don't know what they're doing, but they're there for opposition and for symmetry. Now, I'm not going to go, there's all sorts of other wonderful things that Métraux has to talk about with the Riace warriors. I do want to emphasize here how the balanced, harmonious interior suggested by the venous system on this warrior A matches the interpretation of the sculpture's overall visual impact given by Stewart, whom I mentioned earlier. Here we have a man whose self-sufficient and well-ordered body meets the highest standards of Hellenic manhood. At the same time, there's a tension here between the eternally static sculpture, its interior and exterior apparently in complete balance and composure, and the dynamism that is nonetheless suggested by the figure, who is eternally ready for action. The basic watchword here, I guess, is made in Agon, nothing in excess, a maxim inscribed on the temple of Apollo at Delphi, which certainly contradicts the ethos, or at least the nature, of great heroes such as Achilles, and Heracles, as I mentioned before, where excess is what defines them in many ways. Nonetheless, what we see over and over again in the 5th century art and literature is an ideal of bodily self-sufficiency and self-control, especially for men. And Greek medical thought reflects this. The Hippocratic writers often urge upon their readers the idea that a patient's daily, weekly, monthly, even yearly regimen is an essential factor in their health. Disease is caused by an excess of some substance in the body. Health can be restored and maintained by finding the correct combination of foods, exercises, and hygiene to counteract any excesses. Yet doctors recognize that individual bodies are subject to larger forces beyond their control. The environment, the seasons, the air, the water, heat, cold, moisture, and dryness. These could be managed, perhaps, but never fully mastered. And so disease could never be fully eradicated from human experience. To some extent, it is even possible to see medicine itself developing as a counterweight to the presence of disease. Thus, in the Greek tragedy, Prometheus Bound, Prometheus tells us how he has given humans many different arts with which to handle the difficulties of mortal life, the greatest of which, he asserts, are medicine and prophecy. These do not cause mortal troubles to disappear, but enable humans to endure. And he says, the greatest thing I provided, if someone fell into sickness, there was no remedy, neither food nor ointment nor drink, but from lack of medicines they were wasting away, until I showed them mixtures of gentle remedies with which they could ward off all diseases. Note, too, that he claims to provide gentle remedies to counter the harsh disease. Now, disease is truly a powerful thing. The writers of the Hippocratic corpus use words like attack, seize, squeeze, strike, and weigh down in order to describe the actions of a disease. The disease acts very much like an aggressive warrior in and of itself. Furthermore, when we hear the doctors describe what they envision is going on inside the sick body, we see fluids on the move, fluids out of place, even organs moving around. Note, for example, this passage from Diseases of Young Girls, one of the all-time great treatises. It's only like 3 pages long, but here it is. So you practically have a whole thing right here, where the author is describing the bad things that can happen at the onset of puberty. This is just a small taste of it. It's all in it. But the blood collects in the womb to flow out. But when the mouth of the exit is not opened, and when the blood flows in all the more because of the nourishment and the growth of the body, when the blood has no way to flow out, it rises up from this abundance to the heart and the diaphragm. When these are filled, the heart becomes sluggish, and numbness results from this sluggishness, and then madness comes from the numbness. There appears to be no one controlling organ or mechanism in the body that can put things back into order. Only the restoration of balance of all forces in fixed tension, in symmetry with one another. In the case of these girls, the author suggests that only the removal of excess blood will help, and he suggests a culturally appropriate remedy. The girls need to get married. As he says, let her have intercourse with a husband as soon as possible. This will restore the appropriate balance. There are, of course, many types of diseases and remedies in the corpus that do not use sex as a cure, but when we examine how the patients urge their doctors to respond, what I find striking is how infrequently the language of battle is used. Only once in the Hippocratic corpus is the doctor told to fight the disease, and the patient is never described as doing so. In fact, the poor patient usually is described as incapable of even enduring any disease or pain. Thus, it's really striking. The diseases are all really aggressive. They're attacking, they're fighting, they're all, and the doctor, he doesn't fight. We all think, fight disease. They don't do that in Greek medicine, which is really interesting. They do not fight it, and the patients don't fight it either. What do they do? Well, let's find out. The patient and the doctor have to team up together. In the iconic definition of the art of medicine, the author of Epidemics writes, Epidemics 1, the art, or the skill is a difficult word to translate, the techne consists of 3 things: the disease, the patient, and the healer. The healer is the servant of the techne. It is necessary for the patient to oppose the disease with the help of the healer. So the word then I want to focus on is the word for oppose. What kind of opposition are we talking about here? It is not a military word. It is used commonly to describe opponents in a court or opposing political parties. Another word commonly used by medical writers to talk about how to handle disease is krateia, which means to rule, the same root that we see show up in words like autocratic and democratic. In fact, the reader of the Hippocratic corpus will typically find that while the disease may attack, the patient and the doctor must use the instruments of civil society in order to respond. In the late 5th century, Plato in particular begins to construct very deliberately a parallel between the body and the city-state. While the idea that the health of the king had an impact on the health of society as a whole had a long history in Greek culture, and indeed Mediterranean culture more broadly, and can be found in many other cultures throughout the world, the intricate parallels that Plato makes depend on a notion both of government and of the body that clearly draws upon rationalist medical ideas that are so widespread in the Greek culture of this time. The body in health, like a well-ordered city, has all its parts functioning in harmony. It is stable and serene. Yet Plato developed his ideas in the context of a city, Athens, that prized competition and made debate a centerpiece of its government and judicial system. Now, G.E.R. Lloyd has argued that the intense interest in competition and argument that characterizes so much of Greek political culture was essential to the development of Greek science itself. That forms of inquiry new to the ancient Mediterranean developed in part because of the openness to equality and ideas of citizenship in which anyone could make a good argument, could be heard, and perhaps believed. Lloyd's theory is controversial, but I do not think we should doubt the idea that one of the central narratives of health and disease in ancient Greek culture corresponded with and also helped to advance Greek political ideas in the 5th century. There is rarely only one narrative for disease in any given culture. Different narratives will appeal to different individuals depending on their own particular experiences. In ancient Greece, the newer narratives provided by rationalist healers often sat side by side with other stories in which gods caused disease, or magicians did, or demons, and in which healing gods such as Asclepius could provide a cure to the faithful. The Iliad, above all, continued to provide a narrative pattern which many Greek men at any rate, emulated, or at least against which they measured their own lives. Unlike Achilles, they could not know for sure which gods were rewarding or punishing them, but they could see in the Homeric gods' behavior an explanation of suffering. Our demand that scientific biomedicine be infallible, a common one in 21st century America, relies on a view of science that is itself a product of our culture. Many of us do not know exactly how drugs function in our bodies, but we are convinced that they do. Furthermore, our faith in medicine has, as many argue, also brought about the medicalization of many cultural problems, as if medicine could both identify and cure these things. Looking back at Greek medicine does, I hope, help to illuminate the backdrop of some of our own medical practices, metaphors, and beliefs. It teaches us, I hope, how to think more deeply, more circumspectly, more questioningly, and then perhaps more successfully. Thank you. I'll give you a picture.
Can you speak in the microphone and tell them only people with a microphone can ask a question?
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, tell them.
Oh, only people in the microphone can ask a question, apparently. So you must have a microphone if you have a question.
talking about Athenian society, Eva Kouls characterizes Athens as a phallocracy. And you've mentioned ideas about health as being culturally defined. Is it fair to say then that Greek ideas about health reflect this sort of phallocratic, gendered view of society?
Yes. No. What's interesting, I think, is that to be healthy is to be male. It's interesting when you describe the healthiest body is one that is most in control, is with the least amount of excess. One of the descriptions of bodies that describes female versus male bodies describes male bodies as tightly woven cloth and female bodies as like a sponge of unclean wool. That women are loose, textured creatures and men are tight and compact. That's health. One of the things that I argue in some of the work that I've done is that to some extent disease then is enfeebling for men. It turns them literally, their bodies actually become more feminine. One of the things they have is too much of something. It's excess that causes disease. Women naturally have excess. Women get rid of it usually every month, but they're sort of naturally excessive. Women are wet. They are just overcome usually by tons of different forces in the body, and it's always a struggle to control, although it's interesting, nature has actually provided women through menstruation with this one regularly recurring feature that allows them to kind of get back into some balance, because otherwise they would be just completely nuts most of the time. But men actually then should be really healthy. And the big question, it's like this restoration of balance and equality and something that women just couldn't have. I think women have no rights as citizens, as voters, as rulers in Athenian society. So I don't think it's surprising that then the medicine is heavily gendered in that way too. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
A little confused by your timeline in the beginning with the animals, like the arrows were first shot at the animals. Was that figuratively or was that literally? And was there ever any connection, time-wise, between diseases that would come up because of polluted environments? I know we had one of the first speakers talked about cholera and how people were polluting their own water supply, and that was causing disease. So is that part of that, or did the Greeks never realize there was a connection?
In the period of the Iliad, which is where we began, when Apollo shoots his arrows, it is figurative, although it's interesting. In other like Mesopotamian and Egyptian medicine as well, often use this notion of the arrow, of the dart, that disease is something that comes in and sort of penetrates your body, comes in and grabs you in that way. I mean, I don't think that they really felt that they were seeing arrows, but they may have, and to some extent, there may have been some sense that there was that unseen arrows are coming and getting you. That's early. That's the earliest material. And the Iliad then is coming from, say, the 8th century BC. When we get to the 5th century BC, with sort of the difference between the Archaic and the Classical period, and what happens then is a huge shift in governmental systems in that period too. So we move from much more sort of tribal-based communities, clan-based communities, into these much bigger city-states, and development of different kinds of political systems and things like that. Then we get the development of these new medical ideas as well. Do they believe in pollution or in the environment as a source of pollution, a source of disease? Yes, they do. There's some interesting, they do have an issue of, the author of Nature of Man, actually, he talks about, there's a couple different possibilities. One of the things they want to distinguish between is mass disease epidemic disease, things that a lot of people get at the same time, and individual problems, chronic diseases and individual diseases that maybe one or somebody gets. They do not believe, well, let me answer the question, that the epidemic diseases, a couple of them suggest could be caused by pollution in the air. Pollution, some kind of, just a little bit later, but there is a suggestion that emanations from dead bodies could cause disease. That's another medical theory that arises. And so there's definitely a sense that there's environmental change, environmental factors that can cause diseases. One of the interesting things about the Greek medical writers, though, and this is different with Thucydides, although I talked about him, the author of this, he was an historian, but is clearly very interested in medical theory. He talks about the fact that people catch the disease from one another when he talks about, and so he clearly believes in the idea of contagion, for example. The medical writers that we see really do not believe in contagion. So they think about pollution as something that exists out there that can infect a whole range of people, but they try very hard to suggest that you can't actually catch disease from one another. There's a lot of discussion about why they believe that, why that was so important to them to make that distinction. Some people suggest that it's that they are actually that when we talk about the word pollution and the word that they use for pollution, it has religious connotations, so that you could be polluted as an individual if you killed a person, for example, and you had to be purified before you could come in contact with other people. And that there's some discussion about the possibility that the medical writers didn't want to have any religious ideas interfering with their description of how disease arose. So they do seem to suggest that there is no such thing as physical contact between people that can cause disease. But they, at the same time, do think that environmental factors, things in the world, can affect a lot of people at the same time. Does that sort of answer your question? Or do you have more? No? Okay.
Hi. A plague in 490 BC, possibly in Athens.
430, yeah.
430. Has there been any attempt to identify the pathogen in that instance?
Yes.
Would that be bubonic plague, or would it have been some type of a flu?
There's a huge literature on that. People keep trying to figure out what it is. And I would say unsuccessfully. Some people have suggested typhus. Cholera has also been suggested. Anthrax, bubonic plague. There's been a lot of different possible things put forward. If you read the whole account of the plague, which is really fascinating, but he gives a very, very elaborate set of symptoms. He describes the symptoms in some detail. And that's exactly where the problem comes in. Because the set of symptoms does not match up precisely with anything of the kinds of, the cholera, the typhus, or the anthrax, or any of these things. It doesn't match up precisely with any of one of those things. So there's been one of the arguments is that we know that through mutation and things, disease changes over time, and that may be in fact what's happened. Is it's a plague, that a kind of a form of plague that no longer can be specifically identified. But there are many. It's a recurring. Well, if you read history of medicine journals, you get I would say every 5 or 6 years. Somebody comes out, they think they figured out what the plague is. I think there was one just 2 years ago. There was a big burst of them in the early 90s, and then people thought that were basically arguing we can't figure out what it is. And everybody's like, okay, you're right, we can't figure out what it is. But then more recently, somebody's like, no, I'm still going to try. I'm going to try to figure out what it is. But yeah, so it's well worth reading, though, to read the whole passage. It's a really amazing, the description that he gives. And it was very powerful emotionally. It had a huge effect on ways people described plagues after that. And so much literature is heavily influenced by his description of the plague. And sometimes people think, well, maybe the plague in, say, Diodotus didn't actually happen that way. He's just using Thucydides' description of the plague in order to, sort of like import and, cut and paste. This is how a plague goes. And so it was very, very influential in that way.
Hi. I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for coming to lecture us. I enjoyed it. And my question, incidentally, is also about the plague. It's more metaphorical than physiological, as it were, but here it is. The plagues of early human civilization have been clearly identified as devastating and divisive societal movements amongst the rich and the poor. And since we've developed into relatively more hygienically conscious beings as time's gone by, do you consider the for-profit healthcare companies within the U.S. to be the, quote, modern-day plague?
Ooh. Well, there's a medicalization. Lloyd actually talks in his book a lot about this sort of medicalization of all social problems, right? So medicine is such a pervasive metaphor in some ways. I mean, I was talking about how certain metaphors come into the way people talked about medicine in antiquity, but in a way, I think we use medicine as a metaphor for much of our cultural experience, and we everything is, or many things are figured as a disease or a plague, child abuse, which again, I mean, I don't necessarily suggest that it isn't one, but I mean, the Greeks would never have thought of that as a disease. We do in some ways. Other kinds of social problems turned into medical problems. So to that extent, I mean, when you're talking about, insurance companies, I think, again, that's something that we tend to do in terms of our the way we think about medicine. We've really broadened it as a way of thinking about the world. I do think that medicine was increasingly a way to think about the world in the 5th century, and a lot of the literature. People describe social problems as diseases, but I think it's a much more common metaphor for us now. I'm not sure that I'm going to completely offer an opinion on whether they are, in fact, diseases, those insurance companies and other kinds of things like that. But I think certainly that's not surprising that we, in our culture, might define them in that way. I'm sidestepping your question. I'm sorry. Yes.
In the Iliad, both Achilles and Hector go through a period of aristeia, where they are totally maddened by being in battle, as some of the other heroic figures do. And from the 20th century perception, they're not in balance. They're beyond themselves. They're crazy, and they're just going through almost an out-of-body experience. Some of the reading I've done has tried to relate that to what's happened in Vietnam, the returning Iraqi people who have been in an environment which is so out of the extraordinary, and also linkage where a close friend or a relative, Achilles, Hector, has just died, and they're reacting to this. To me, from the 20th century perspective, that's mental as well as a certain extreme environmental effect. When you read Homer, you don't get any sense of right or wrong, or it's just part of the effect of battle. Can you add any more to that?
Yeah. Jonathan Shea, I think, is particularly the person that you're talking about, who wrote that wonderful book called Achilles in Vietnam, and I highly recommend it to anybody. It's a fantastic book. It's a wonderful read. Jonathan Shea, who's a psychiatrist, I believe, who works with veterans in Boston. But anyway, and he read the Iliad 1 year in a seminar, and saw it very much in terms of the true battle experience that Achilles suffers, the kinds of things that we see described in the experience of battle that people, like the berserk experience in particular, is one of the things that he talks about. I think that one of the great debates about the Iliad is, what is its position on war, and what kind of war poem is it, and how does it see the effect of war on human beings, and therefore, is it an anti-war poem? I think that there is a strong sense that war does affect the way people behave. That Achilles' rage is partly his rage over mortality and the fact that he will die young in war. He knows one of the advantage or disadvantage that Achilles has over all the other warriors is that he knows he will die. The others don't. So there's kind of a rage at his mortality, a rage at his death that is inevitable because he is in war. If he had stayed home, he could have lived a long life with his father and his family and taken care of people. He could have been at home, but he knows he's at war and he will die. And not only that, then once he's made certain decisions, his deepest friend, his cousin Patroclus, dies too, partly because of his own decisions. So I think there are definitely strong feelings about war that are there in the Iliad. But I would also say that I'm not sure that the Iliad is an anti-war poem. I think it's a real, for all the say the unrealism of the plague or whatever, with what we might consider the arrows of the plague and other kinds of things, that I think, and for all that it's an epic about these great heroes, and for all that it takes place in a world, far apart in time, in many ways it's an intensely realistic poem. And to that extent, I think it suggests that whether we like war or not, whether we want it or not, however we feel about it, it will always be with us. It is as intrinsic to human nature, which I do find a little bit sad. I think that's why it's a tragic poem. But it is intensely realistic in that sense. And so I don't think we can necessarily say it's anti-war, because it's not anti-human, and it is suggesting that because we are human, we will fight. And it's intensely realistic in that way. It is a poem always of the present in that sense, that war is always part of human experience. And that kind of sense of what we are as human beings then, as raging people capable of wonderful acts, but also horrific ones, again, I think is part of why it is so important that it take place in battle. That it shows the range of human experience, the range of human behavior, the range of things that we're capable of, that all of us are capable of, even if Achilles himself is perhaps physiologically and mentally and everything else beyond our experience because he has these special qualities. But as Shay and others have noted, there's a lot of true realism, I think, in the Iliad. I don't know if that answers your question. So, yeah.
Are there any records of surgeries, of repairing malformed limbs, of brain surgery, etc.? The Egyptians were certainly practiced. I'm not sure how successful, but I wondered if Greeks in the various periods going back to
yes,
medical records.
There are.
And what sort?
Yes, the Hippocratic treatises, there are about 63 of these treatises. They cover a whole range of different things. There are three of them in particular that are considered to be perhaps more successful because in some ways they're not dealing with physiological issues. They're dealing with trauma, and they seem to have actually been better with trauma in some ways than with drug, with internal diseases. So there's we do have one called Wounds in the Head, which features describes trepanation and other kinds of things that physicians could do, presumably, to help people with wounds in the head. There's a fairly long treatise on fractures, which talks a lot about what you could do with, a dislocation, broken arms, broken legs, and is actually quite successful. I mean, again, from the reading I've done of doctors who have evaluated it, some of it probably we would say, no, that's exactly the opposite of what we think now, but some of it seems to have been quite successful. So that's the 5th century BC, 4th century BC. And then we know from the Roman period, there's evidence of successful cataract surgery, for example. There's a lot more instrumentation available in the archaeological finds and other kinds of things like that allow people to sort of figure out what they were doing, all the probes that they had, and things that just really don't necessarily make you feel too comfortable when you look at them. But that yes, they did do that. But you're right. I mean, the ability to handle head wounds. I mean, the technology that they used, it goes right back to, like I said, the Edwin Smith papyrus, which is about 1500 BC from the, and it goes back even earlier than that, Egyptian papyrus, which does describe successfully, apparently, types of surgery for the head. And a lot of the problem would have not been the surgery itself, but all of the complications that would have gone along with it. And so they were the surgery, to some extent, they were able to do seems quite successful. It's the infection and other kinds of things that they were really bad at, actually. They really misunderstood infection, I have to say. Again, I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't give you all the particulars on that. But one of the things that for example, with infection, one of the things that they often suggest is putting dirty, greasy wool onto a wound. And the reason that you would do that is because dirty, greasy wool will attract the dirt in the wound and will pull it out. They're also big on pus. They think pus is good, so they want to induce it. And I guess, I mean, in some ways you could say, well, pus is to some extent a sign of certain things, but it's a medical sign that you could read in different ways. But they always read it positively, and they want to actually induce it. So they're actually, they're not very good on that at all. And so in fact, although the kinds of surgery that they're doing could actually be quite successful if they could then deal with the infection and other kinds of complications that would go along with it. That's where the people seem to have died, I think.
In your lecture, you cited Thucydides's reference to the patient's attitude in healing. And I was wondering if you could comment on the conflicts between natural and spiritual approaches to healing and the role of dreams in diagnosis in ancient Greece.
Yeah. As I tried to suggest, a lot of people talk about the fact that there were probably people had dual belief systems potentially. They may have tried anything that worked, or anything they felt that worked. So that different a scholar called Vivian Nutton talks about the medical marketplace in antiquity. How there are different types of medical professions professions, I guess one could say, that attempt to persuade people to come and be healed by them. So people are trying to use attractive ideas. Therefore, dreams definitely have a place in the belief system, that dreams are meaningful in some way. And there are two ways that we see, many ways that we see this operating in antiquity. But one is that the medical doctors themselves have some treatises in which they talk about the predictive value of dreams and how a patient's dream can help you figure out what's wrong with them internally. So that they use a dream as a kind of diagnostic factor. So not so much as a healing factor, but as a diagnostic factor. Then there's perhaps much more extensively used in religious healing, particularly Asclepius, the sanctuaries of Asclepius, the healing god Asclepius, who doesn't cause disease but heals it. Unlike, he's the son of Apollo. Apollo can cause and heal disease, but Asclepius only heals disease. And people would go to medical sanctuaries these sanctuaries of Asclepius, and they would spend the night in the temple, and they were supposed to have a dream. And we actually have some wonderful records of these dreams that they had. If you go to Epidaurus, the great sanctuary of Epidaurus in Greece, where they have the great theater there too, they still have they have records that were inscribed on the outside of the temple, showing successful dreams, successful healing experiences, and a record of an advertisement for our services, that we, if you come into our temple and have this dream, you will be healed. And so there were dreams that people had, like a man with a spear in his jaw, and he dreams that it falls out in the middle of the night, and then he wakes up and by golly, it has fallen out. So there's a whole bunch of dreams that are recorded. And that was a really important part of the way the sanctuary of Asclepius worked. Over time, they do suggest, as you look at the sanctuary of Asclepius and the kinds of medicine that they're practicing at the sanctuary of Asclepius, it's clear that the two systems are kind of coming together. We have the sort of rationalist doctors who are using dreams diagnostically, but basically saying, gods are not causing disease and gods are not part of the way we practice. They begin, in fact, to interact to some extent with the sanctuaries. And so the kinds of explanations that the priests at the sanctuaries begin to give, actually, that we start to see them giving the same kind of language, so that the way that people begin to perceive their diseases becomes a little bit more universalized. What is causing it, even though what could heal it, a dream from Asclepius and an experience with Asclepius versus going to a doctor and he gives you a drug or tells you to run around the track 50 times, those are different healing experiences. But the explanatory models for different kinds of disease, those actually start to coincide quite a bit.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
Great talk. I'm so stimulated. Did you just describe two camps, rationalist doctors? On the one hand, was there a constant ongoing debate between different types of practice in medicine? Also, as the metaphor has evolved or changed from, I think you mentioned, like prophetic to political to whatever came, was there a shift in the various arguments about how to treat patients? And did the language influence the way procedures were done?
Yeah, I think that the medical doctors of the 5th century were very much trying to get away from the notion of divine causation, so that they very much believe that in restoring balance and that kind of thing, as I suggested. What's interesting, I think, that we could say is if we see a shift, as you say, from prophetic to political, the next step is I guess, for lack of a better word, philosophical. Although philosophy is heavily influenced by politics. But by the time we get to the great 5th century, great Greco-Roman doctor Galen, Galen is convinced that philosophy and medicine are that the best doctor should be a philosopher and the best philosopher should be a doctor, that those two things really should go hand in hand. And so I would say that that's sort of the next great step at least in the rationalist tradition. We don't have as much evidence. We have this Asclepius stuff, the material from the Asclepius sanctuaries. The other kinds of practices that we know about them, but most of what we know about them are told by the so-called rationalist doctors. So they tend to be pretty dismissive. They talk about the charlatans, the charlatans who argue this, this, and this, and they talk about how amulets and avoiding wearing goat skins if you have was epilepsy. Epilepsy was traditionally associated with goats, well, I guess goats do get epilepsy actually, so it's not totally out of the range of experience. But so the so-called rationalist doctors go on and on about how awful these other people are for suggesting these kinds of things, like don't wear goat skin. They say that makes absolutely no sense at all. That wouldn't help an epileptic in any way. You know what really causes epilepsy? It's too much phlegm in your brain, and it overflows and comes down and blocks off the breathing. And makes you choke and all that kind of thing. That's what really causes epilepsy. It had nothing to do with goats. And so, of course, they have their own ideas. But we hear most about other medical ideas filtered through the material of these rationalists. So it's a lot harder to talk about other traditions, except as we see them filtered. We don't have any other medical writers outside this tradition, so it's harder to get at. The root cutters, these old women who were going out and cutting, herbs at the dark of the moon, they didn't write anything down, so we just don't have a good sense of what they were doing.
With this wonderful explanation, we come to the end of the session. Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Professor Kosak.
Thank you all much. Thank you for your attention.